Our next speaker comes from the University of the Virgin Islands, so we're really transversing the globe here. Uh, and her presentation is Femininity and Phonetics in Drag Names. So would you like to introduce yourself, Marianne Walter?
Yes, I love to. We're moving from the midnight sun to the land of no winter over here in the Virgin Islands. I'm an associate professor of English in here with responsibility for our linguistics coursework. And I didn't manage to pre-record my presentation, but I do have some slides to share. Okay, so I'm thrilled to be back here at the ANS conference for the third time, third year in a row, and hopefully more to come in the future. My project, this current project, is about phonetics and femininity in drag names, and it's drawing on a literature about gender and differences in first names, which is very well documented in terms of their phonetic properties cross-linguistically. So both in English primarily, but also in Chinese and as well as elsewhere, there are these statistical patterns and preferences in what we see for feminine names versus masculine names, where female associated or feminine names are more likely to have a higher percentage of open syllables. So no coda consonants closing off syllables, or at least less of them. And more high front vowels. So these are the E and I vowels in phonetic transcription. Female associated names are more likely to have more of those. And also more sonorant consonants. So among the consonants which do appear, it's likely that this set, L, R, M, N, W, and Y, will be overrepresented in names for women, or at least more feminine considered names. So it's a continuum, it's a statistical tendency. Of course, there are lots of exceptions and counterexamples with individual names, but that's the pattern that we see across the board. And we also know that there are race or ethnically based differences in names. And there are, in the American context, preferred names for African Americans versus white Americans within those communities. And it's not a case of something like Hispanic names where there might be differences based on the language origin of the names. They're all English language origin names, but there are just different favorite ones, we could say. So that's also been extensively documented in the literature, as well as some of the effects that creep in due to social biases as a reaction to these names, because it turns out, maybe unsurprisingly, that people, the members of the public, are very well aware of these name associations, their ethnic associations, and then of course they make decisions based on that in terms of hiring and other decisions based on the origin of the name for certain people. And what I tried to show here 2 years ago is that this difference extends to the phonetic characteristics that names have in these different ethnic communities within the US. So I was first interested to see whether the same phonetic patterns that were seen in English more generally and cross-linguistically were attested within African American communities, and I found that they were very much so. But not only that, there was a kind of spectrum from the masculinity end of the continuum toward the femininity end of the continuum, where African American men and boys tended to have names that were more feminine according to these three phonetic criteria compared to white American men. And similarly, that African American women had names that were even more feminine compared to white American women. So there was this kind of spread, which was quite interesting. And I speculated about the reasons for that. But the important part, especially for today, is just for us to recognize that there are these intersecting, interacting factors. And it showed us that it's not only a gender difference, that other aspects of our social identities come into play, like, for example, ethnicity, and affect the, in, the intensity of these effects. So there was an exaggeration of phonetic femininity for Black Americans, both male and female, compared to their white counterparts. And again, what is phonetic femininity? It means open syllables, more front high vowels, and more sonorants in the names. So my next question was to look at other aspects of social identity beyond ethnicity, beyond race, and see what was happening there. And since since gender, we know already, is relevant, sexuality is an obvious next place to look. And there has been some research, but very little, about the linguistics of drag performances and drag names. And of course, this is a perfect example of gender as performance. That's what drag is. So this very group, exactly 20 years ago, at the meeting 20 years ago, had a special panel event on queer names of stage, screen, and fiction. With a wonderful paper by Arnold Zwicky about gay male porn names and what they were like, and other wonderful contributions. But then there was sort of a long lag, a long drought of research in this area until a handful of years ago with the first major study of drag language. In 2017, Rusty Barrett's book, Drag Queens to Leatherman. And he found that what Black Texan drag queens do is use stereotypically white women's speech as a way of indexing and performing femininity. And finally, very recently indeed, there's been a discussion of linguistic indexing of pride by participants in RuPaul's Drag Race and how they do that. So it's not specifically about names, but it's about linguistic aspects of language of drag performers. And it uses this wonderful corpus that we have available by virtue of this series, which most people know about, RuPaul's Drag Race, which ran for such a long time and had such a pop culture presence. In the United States and abroad, there are many international versions of it as well. So Marjanovic's study uses it as a source of data, and so does this other study from a couple of years ago, an MA thesis, which is about specifically drag names, again, as used in RuPaul's Drag Race. And Slordahl found that they often involve puns. They are sort of countercultural in terms of violating spelling rules as well. There are associated semantic domains that are preferred, like fashion and nightlife. And often they are exaggeratedly feminine, Slordahl says, without exactly defining what that means linguistically, exaggeratedly feminine, but not always. There are some notable exceptions, like Bob, who went on to also perform in a Dungeons and Dragons based television show, also as Bob. Bob the drag queen was his character in that one. So this analysis was based entirely on semantics, the meanings of the names and their connotations, rather than their phonetic properties. So this is what I took as the next step, was to take this wonderful corpus of names of the contestants over the seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race and evaluate them phonetically according to what we already know about these phonetic properties. And here's one of the contestants, Anastasia Anakue. And it's a perfect example of taking a name which is already quite feminine phonetically, Anastasia. It's got 4 open syllables. It's got some sonorants in there. And what did this performer do? Take that name and then add another sonorant by putting an R in the middle, which increases its score on this phonetic femininity index. Okay, so these are our questions. There are a number of possible ways it could go, a number of hypotheses we could entertain. So, these performers are primarily men, and they are living their lives as men. And so we might expect their drag names to be less feminine compared to the standard for this phonetic criteria. On the other hand, they're performing a very exaggerated version of femininity, so maybe we would expect them to be more feminine compared to the sort of baseline of phonetic femininity, or maybe intermediate between the two, or maybe none of the above. There's always the null hypothesis that they're not they're not able to take this into account subconsciously in their name choice. And then the follow-up question is, whatever they are doing, has it changed over time? Because the whole social context of drag performances has changed so much over the last 20 years or so, from being a very outlier, kind of marginalized thing, to gaining a large degree of relative acceptance, along with, and maybe because of, this television program. And then the sort of flowering of drag queen story time, which were very public, very communal, even for children, but then some backlash against that. And now, of course, things continue to change in various ways. So looking for any observable changes in the name choices as well in association with those things. So there were 16 seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race, with mostly different performers, some returning ones. And that yielded a corpus of just about exactly 200 names of all the different performers that were featured on it. And luckily, because of this previous work, I had a very nicely counterbalanced corpus of male and female, white and black names, also 200, taken from these earlier sources about specific properties they had. So it was nicely comparable. Of course, because it was balanced for ethnicity, it's 50% Black names, which is much higher than the actual percentage in the population of the United States. But I felt this was appropriate because also within the drag queen world, it's not normally distributed in terms of ethnicity for whatever reason. And it also makes the comparison much more conservative. So it's harder to outscore this comparison corpus on the terms of femininity because it's already more so phonetically due to choosing this population that favors such names, that is, Black Americans. So these are the results by identity, by which I mean a three-way comparison between masculine names and feminine names and drag names, which are the female performance names chosen by male performers. And we can see that they mostly line up in increasing order. So percent open syllables. How many of the syllables in the name do not have a coda consonant? It's about 40% for male names, but then we see a big jump in the drag names to almost 70%. And then the feminine names are also right at 70%. And there's a significant difference here between the male names and the drag names. So the drag names are significantly more likely to have more open syllables compared to the male names. But there's no statistically significant difference between the drag names and the female names. They display open syllables at exactly the same rate. And if we look at vowel quality, we see, vowel consonant ratio. That's what the second thing is. It's another slightly different way to calculate, very similar to the percent open syllable criterion. How many vowels are there compared to consonants? So if there's more vowels, there will be a higher score. And of course, we need more vowels to have more open syllables. because every syllable needs to have a vowel. It doesn't always need to have consonants. So replication of the same pattern, unsurprisingly, where the male names are significantly different from the drag names and female names. And then with the high front vowels, we see something different and new, which is that the drag names are significantly different from both of the other groups, the male names and the female names. So they're in an intermediate position, which was also true for the first two factors. But for those, they weren't statistically distinguishable from the female names. But here they are. So they're right in the middle, and they're not patterning with either the male names or the female associated names. And then there's the criterion about sonorants, percentage of sonorant consonants within the name. And surprisingly, here we see that the drag names have less rather than more compared to the male names. And again, that is a statistically significant difference. So then there's the diachronic aspect. And what I did here was compare the names from the first two seasons and the last two seasons. So these were 15 years apart in time. And for most, we don't see a big change, not a significant change. In fact, we see a small decrease in terms of the femininity of the names for the first three criteria, but it's not significant, except for the percent sonorants. So we expect a higher percentage of sonorants for the more feminine associated names. And that it seems that the drag names are approaching that norm more as time went by and when it came to the later seasons. So let me just click backwards again. We saw that in terms of having more sonorants, drag names were not acting more feminine overall. But if we look at just the later years, we see that starting to become the case because the later drag names from the final seasons are including more sonorants compared to the earlier ones. So to sum that all up now, what we find is that for most of these phonetic factors, the drag names are patterning in the same way as American feminine names are overall, and not the same way as American masculine names, and also not falling in between, except for one out of our phonetic criteria, but even that one seems to be changing as we go through the years and becoming more feminine as well. So these performers are definitely consciously or subconsciously conforming to these gendered expectations that we have for name and exploiting that when they choose their drag names, in addition to the other things that they're doing with respect to vocabulary and the lexical and semantic aspects of the names that they choose for themselves. And this is the list of references and a little sneak peek at where I think this research is going, is that I'd like to look next at derby names for roller derby performances. And there's also a very rich corpus of these. In fact, too rich, because there is a master list, a roster. Nobody is allowed to have the same name, nobody in the world. And it's now over 40,000 names. And of course, derby is something that's also performance, and it's also a very gendered performance, but in a very, very different way from drag performances. So for derby, it's primarily female performers, although there is men's derby. That's something that sprung up only very recently. But what Wikipedia says a derby name should be like is that it should show both aggression and humor. So the aggression aspect is something very different and non-stereotypically feminine. So maybe, hopefully, I'll have an update for you on that next year. Let's see. But for now, I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, or questions about the drag names. Thank you.
And thank you. Do we have questions or thoughts or comments, either in the chat or raise your hand? I will start with a question then. So I'm not, I mean, I'm familiar with what RuPaul's Drag Races was. I'm not sure that I've ever watched a full episode. It's kind of come across my screen, across my radar. So is this primarily US based, or was this wider than just either the US or North America or whatever? Can you contextualize it a little bit for me?
Yes, definitely. So it certainly started as US based.
Okay.
And although always extremely diverse, and many of the early performers were Black Americans, Hispanics, Filipino,
Okay.
so lots of diversity there. But then, with its great success as a television program, reality show, there were international versions, several different ones, mostly still in English-speaking countries. Oh, Donald, not in this corpus, but they're bound to be coming, right?
So then
Um,
the first 2 years that you looked
mhm.
at would have been different, perhaps culturally or
Ah,
geographically from the last 2 years?
yes. So these international ones were separate. So they're separate series. So I did not include the data from those. Uh, and they were just running as separate series on Australian television, British television, wherever else they were. German, I think. Germany had one.
Okay, thank you. We do have a
Mhm.
question from Sarah.
Hi, Marianne. This is very exciting. I'm also starting to work on drag and derby names, specifically in the Jewish
Really?
community. So
Oh,
I'm excited for your papers to come out so I can cite them. So my question is about correlating the phonetics with the semantics, and whether these are historically male or female names. Have you done any of that research as well?
correlating the
like
phonetics
like
of
you know
semantic.
you have your index of femininity of a name, and then can you look at the name and see if it incorporates elements of a name like Anastasia, which is a
Mhm.
historically female name?
Um, I'm not totally sure still. I know where you're going, but I'll try, and then you'll correct me if I don't get it. Um, so it has been shown, I think, not for any historical data sets, but for different language backgrounds, Chinese as well as English, and then these ethnic variations. And so it's not really related to the semantics of the name.
Or no, but I meant specifically with the drag names.
Yes.
If you have a name like Bob, then that is a historically masculine
Hmm.
name, and
Hmm.
so you can see how the index of sonority and the phonetic index that you have correlates with that. And so have you done that analysis with the drag names, is what I'm asking.
Yes, that's what this is. So let
No,
me just.
I understand that it's about the you're analyzing, yes, but my question is specifically about the are the drag names all women's names?
Oh, no, they're not. And so I just counted all of the drag names, including the ones like Bob and Derek, which were a small minority, but there were ones like that. And I just said, well, they're drag names, and I tossed them in there. And they were such a small number that I'm sure it wouldn't have made any difference if I had not included them. But I did include them as drag names, yeah, without separating them out. And I don't think it would have been worth doing that because you couldn't do any statistics on the group of three names or something that was left that
Right,
was
but
not.
were there also names that were neither male nor female?
Um, Not that I remember. I don't know if we can classify that a priori at all, really.
Well, I mean, you could look at rosters of, the Social Security website for baby names and whether they're used for
Oh,
girls and.
yes. Although most of these would not show up on those rosters anyway, because they're coinages.
Right. So I guess my question is about the coinages, whether parts of the name are actual names, like
Mhm.
Barbara something or other, that kind of.
Mhm, mhm.
Anyway, just something
Yes.
to think about.
Okay. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. So sometimes there were ones which I did not include because they didn't include what I would consider a first name. So like Madame something. And I'm not going to use Madame because it's not a first name. And then the second part is not a first name either. So I didn't include those. Um, there was something else related to that I wanted to add, but it's gone out of my head. Sorry, yes. But that's also a complication with the Derby names doing a comparison, because you've probably seen that they usually are like name surname format, and there's a tight pun link between that makes it all fit together as a name. So that just complicates making a comparison with all this previous research, which is done on the basis of first names only. Not sure what to do with that yet.
I believe we have another hand up. Cleveland?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very interested in it. I have a lot of uh, uh, comments about it. Of course, the drag names are, in a sense, they're chosen because these people are trying to be professional or amateur entertainers, and so they want things that stick out in that way. Uh, in my experience, um, men who are cross dressers but are not doing it for drag, but for other reasons, often pick uh, female names, which I'm sure phonetically are closer to female, but they aren't. Um, they aren't things like Beneath the Sheets, or Jennifer Fox. They're usually a name which actually could be their own sister. Fits in with the names that are common for women of their age. Um, I also think it was interesting when you said at the beginning about Black names, both male and female, being more toward the feminine side in terms of linguistics. The one aspect that does go along with that I didn't think you remember, excuse me if I somehow didn't catch it, but was the stress pattern is that in American culture, most of the male names which are stressed on the second syllable in American English, like Maurice and Bernard and Demetrius, have ended up becoming predominantly African American because I think white parents sort of unconsciously avoid that. They feel that's a feminine, stress pattern to have the accent on the later syllable. And then I think some of the other names which are more common in the African American community, like or have been like Percy and Reginald and Lionel, uh, are also names which white Americans avoid because they think they're effete and British upper class sounding, but many black parents are attracted to them for exactly the same reason because they want to give their sons names which sound like they are as good as anybody else. And so
Yeah.
upper class sounding names are more positive for black parents than white parents in a sense. So
Oh, absolutely. I think you're on the right track with that. And that was my speculation, is that the having more feminine sounding names for Black Americans is actually safer and less threatening seeming to the white mainstream society that they'll be interacting with. And then as far as the stress pattern, I did not look at that because it hasn't been identified as a gender related thing. But interestingly, this is something that Zwicky's study of gay male porn names did mention, which is that they strongly favor a trochaic strong weak stress pattern, which conforms to a kind of typical, he calls it white bread, all-American male pattern.
Thank you both very much for your final comments there, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.